Hi, and welcome everyone to this tech showcase around SuzieQ Enterprise. So I'm really excited to have Dinesh Dutt here today to talk about his SuzieQ Enterprise version. And just to frame things of what this talk is all about is, one, I've been a massive fan of SuzieQ for a while now, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a bit. It's a great tool, but we'll dive into that. But one thing I've been wondering recently, and I've been wanting to learn more about, is the differences between the enterprise and the open source version. So rather, I thought, well, let's record this and get this information over to you good folks, to kind of learn more about the SuzieQ Enterprise as well. So welcome, Dinesh.
Thank you, Rick. It's really sweet of you to have me over on this talk. Thank you for taking the time. I hope I make it worth the while for your listeners and your audience.
Yeah, no doubt you will, Dinesh. Good stuff. So what we're going to do within this session is I'm just going to talk about and frame what SuzieQ is before we even dive into the SuzieQ Enterprise and start figuring out what the enterprise is and the differences between that and the open source version. And so what SuzieQ is SuzieQ is an observability tool that allows you to get basically a whole ton of information from your network, and then you can query that information through various means, such as like a CLI, a GUI, REST, so various types of APIs there. But the key thing with SuzieQ is that it gives you, one, a really nice CLI for your ops teams. So it's not just a REST API or a GUI. So it's a really nice CLI tool that comes bundled in with the product as well. It's multi-vendor. It gets a ton of different information from your network. It's like really rich. Gives you time-based analysis, so you can look at your network at a different point in time. Gives you all the data back in a normalized format. But just to frame things a bit more, is typically what happens is you start getting some information from your network. You start reading this information in. And then you say to yourself, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I could get this information into a database? And you go, okay, well, I've now figured the problem that once you've overcome the problem of getting the data from the network, you then need to get the data into a database. And at that point, you need to figure out how to kind of create a data model and get it into kind of a normalized format, all of the various database elephants in the room that you have to tackle. And at that point, you say, okay, well, I've got it into the database. Now I need a kind of a way to be able to query this and to be able to kind of report on this. How do I do that? Well, there's various different ways of doing that. Do I need to build a UI? Do I need to, do some kind of elastic search against that data? All of these different things. And it's all of this is a common use case that a lot of people kind of want to do on their journey with network automation. And this is what SuzieQ gives you. When you're going down that path and you're trying to figure out and you want to get this data into a database, et cetera, that is what SuzieQ is going to solve for you and take away all of those headaches. And show you just based on this SuzieQ architecture. So basically, we poll the network, we get the data back from our pollers, we put it into a database. Within this database, it's stored in a normalized format. We can then query this database. All the data in the database is marked with a timestamp. So we can then look at our data at different times or a period of time using these different APIs. And yeah, so CLI, GUI, or REST API. So, and the other thing to mention, so we've also got the Python library there you can use as well. So that's the kind of the high level. And I'm sure Dinesh at this point is thinking, there's probably lots of bits that I might have left out, but that is it at a high level. It's probably always weird, Dinesh, isn't it, when you hear someone talk about your product in literally 2 minutes and it's something you've been working on for like years.
No, I think it sums up really well how others look at it. There's always an insider perspective and an outsider perspective. And my perspective has always been to be able to embrace both, because the user is at the end of the day the primary person for whom this tool is written. If this tool is not useful for the user and it's their perception of how they look at it is not useful, then the tool is not very valuable. So no, I appreciate how you were able to frame it.
We got the next slide, which talk about the supported devices. So it supports the top three there: the Cisco, the Arista, the Juniper. Then we've got the Cumulus, the Sonic, and then for Palo Alto, the last time I checked, Dinesh, did it just support the layer 3 abilities of the Palo Altos?
It functions as a router or a switch or a bridge. It does not support the security ACL firewall policies part of it yet.
Yeah, so you got a good coverage there, and you've got the iOS and on the XE to cover the legacy devices there as well, which is good. So
the enterprise version have added support for wireless controllers.
Okay, nice. What is that? The Cisco, like WLCs?
Yes, the AirOS is Cisco iOS XE. We also support iOS XE based wireless controllers. And if a particular customer signs on, we will also be supporting Aruba wireless controllers. But we are adding new devices all the time as customers come on. So there is support. We are going to be adding support for SR Linux soon. We talked about Aruba wireless controllers. But basically, all of this is driven very much by the customers signing on and requesting their access to these devices that they have in their network. So as they come on, we quickly add on these new devices and new services. We have added plenty of things. We'll talk about the enterprise version. There's so much more to talk about than just devices and services.
Cool, good stuff. Well, at this point, if I hand over to you to then kind of move things forward into the enterprise world.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks for that introduction. And as Rick said, there are lots of use cases. And now, originally, this whole thing started off as an open source project. It was more a labor of love than anything. It remains a labor of love. The open source version is going to continue to be supported. It is going to continue to be developed. All of that is not going to change. However, we have been developing an enterprise version in parallel because a lot of people have been asking for additional features, more testing, more various things, which all just take a lot more time that I will need to do something more than just be able to look at it in my spare time, so to speak. So that said, we've started a little company around it, and we are working on SuzieQ Enterprise, and we've been working on it for a little while now, for about a few months. And in that process, we have added a whole bunch of stuff. So primarily today, SuzieQ from a use case perspective, these are all the different ways in which we see people actually using SuzieQ, whether it be open source or enterprise. We see people using it for network quotient or understanding their network, whether they be consultants coming in, plugging it into a customer's network and trying to make sense of the network, or MSPs trying to make sense of networks that they are going to manage. Or just enterprise network teams that are looking to understand their network. For example, they get an end of life. They want to figure out what devices have that end of life because they just get a serial number and they have to map it to a specific device name. Or it could be that they want to go talk to a vendor about the uptimes of a particular device, a model, which is not showing the quality. I've heard from people saying like, hey, I took this device, Dinesh, I took SuzieQ Enterprise, and I was actually able to go talk to a vendor and point out to them that the new releases actually are very buggy and I'm patching them quite often. People, of course, use it for troubleshooting. Validation is another key component that we are enabling in the enterprise, far more than we have enabled in the open source, and we'll talk about that. Planning is another thing. We have right now people who are using SuzieQ for network refresh. There are multiple people who are using SuzieQ for network refresh. One of our biggest deployments is for network refresh and for security actually as well. And from a security perspective, people have been able to, if you look at this picture, one of the nice parts about SuzieQ is it's a completely disaggregated architecture. It follows the Unix principle of loosely coupled pieces. So we can throw away the polar tomorrow and the rest of it need not change. And as far as you are concerned as a user, it'll look the same. We can change the model we use to pull data today with tomorrow's latest fashion polar, and again the rest of the things don't change and you as a user will continue to use it. The database has been set up for schema evolution, which means that if you want new fields added to something that we don't hold tomorrow, we just add it and your data is being pulled. Your old data doesn't go away, your new data stays as it is. And with respect to the data repository, the way we use the data right now, one of the things that seems to shock pretty much every user who's been using SuzieQ for a long time is how little space SuzieQ data takes up, because we don't really aggregate any data. It's complete raw data as you saw it with no changes still saved from pretty much the time you started running the polar. And you could, of course, run the poller not just in the polling mode, but also in the snapshot mode. And like I was pointing out, from a security perspective, people use SuzieQ by taking third-party databases like Cisco ICE, and we can pull data from Cisco ICE either via CSV or some other mechanism, integrated with SuzieQ data, and present to you a uniformed view. For example, you could choose to say, I want to be able to look at the DHCP table, pull the information about every MAC address that I have information about in the Cisco ICE database, compare the policy of whether the MAC addresses in the Cisco database, in the DHCP database, correspond to the appropriate policy configured in ICE or not. And if not, give me a message telling me that this is wrong. This can be done today with SuzieQ Enterprise, and people are doing it today. So that's another advantage of the disaggregated architecture, is we don't really care if the data is coming from SuzieQ's saved native state or whether we have to pull the data from some other data store. Today, we support pulling it from third-party data stores such as Cisco's ICE and a couple of others, which we today pull via CSV files, but we can also pull it directly from REST. That's a feature that's coming in. And other data stores can be easily added in a similar fashion in the enterprise world. Yes.
With the Prometheus side of things, so how does that look? So this is with the third-party data stores. That's an enterprise thing,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so that is all about just kind of enriching the data within that database with additional.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like I said, so for example, if you've got security policy stored in Cisco ICE database, we can pull that data and then marry it with the data that we have in the network to validate. One example was to validate whether MAC addresses which should be assigned an IP address via DHCP did get assigned an IP address via DHCP. You could also look at the VLAN and say like, hey, is this MAC address supposed to be in this VLAN? Because the Cisco ICE policy might say that this particular MAC address needs to be in a particular zone with a particular VLAN, which if this particular MAC address is not, we can get notified. You can be notified as a user about it. So all of these things are possible using the third-party data stores. Prometheus is an example. We don't support Prometheus directly today, but we know how to make it happen. So it's just a question of a customer coming up to us and saying, hey, I want you to integrate Prometheus into the SuzieQ data store. So with that, and the use cases we talked about network refresh. We have some users, especially universities, looking at synchronizing us from the perspective of the 911 calls. The wireless controllers have a MAC address which they need to synchronize with the 911 responders, and they can validate that the information that's being sent is accurate, because now they don't have to log into every wireless controller to figure that out. They just get all that information in a very simple format from SuzieQ and they can push it out. So there is lots of use cases. There are network teams looking at our validation to be able to actually run their network automation tests using SuzieQ validation, which we'll talk about in a bit. So when it comes to enterprise, what is the difference between open source and enterprise? A simple way to think about it is enterprise version is for production networks. There are some people who are using SuzieQ and enterprise in the open source version in their enterprise, but that is dependent on how small your network is or what kind of features you're looking for. There is just a whole bunch of stuff for which SuzieQ open source does not match up. That said, if you want to get started, you can always get started with the open source version. So what is the difference? From a very fundamental level, we do a lot more testing with the enterprise. We also have a lot more features, which we'll talk about in a second. We are also, all the features that are there, most of them have started from the open source, but over time have completely diverged, and we'll see what I mean by that. So they are far more performant and they're far more scalable versions. And more importantly, we have made things that can be tailored to individual network operational teams rather than be generic the way the open source is. So we'll take a look at what each of these mean in a little more detail in the next few slides. So I want to be always careful of not talking about things that are not in the software. I don't want to talk about slideware. So I want to be very precise and talk about features which are shipping now. I do make one small exception. We are having a release, an enterprise release go out the end of this week. I'm going to include that in this talk as a way that it is already there because the feature is in, we are in the final testing phases. It just needs to go out. So with that said, we support an enterprise grade poller. What does an enterprise grade poller mean? The poller looks the same, but we allow it for easy deployment. We also support via Kubernetes an easier deployment. We support Kubernetes Helm charts. People have asked us, will we support a VM, an appliance VM, so to speak, and we can provide an appliance VM. The reason we haven't got a default one is every VM, every network operator, especially if they are a bank, financial institution, or some other healthcare institutions, they have their own authorized or security approved VMs. We can easily work with them. So we want to make that something that's specific to the customer. And in terms of just the poller, the enterprise grade poller uses 35% less memory and uses 50% less CPU than the open source version. This basically means that when you are, for example, there was a user who was trying to pull down a huge table from from their network, a lot of routing, they have a lot of routing state. They were trying to, and also how much activity you have in your network. These can change. So these are just rough estimates based on some of the users, customers that we have today.
So if you had like, I'm just wondering how it would work out, like with that 16 gig, like getting it down to a 16 gig polar, how many devices that was for?
So I don't know the specific use. I believe in their specific use case, it was 76 devices. I believe it was 76. But what I know are some of the numbers, but I don't have the exact memory footprint because some of the people who went to enterprise didn't deploy the same number of devices. You know, in order for me to be able to do this, I need to be able to tell them, first, run everything with open source, then switch and run everything with enterprise in order for you to give me this kind of information. That's not always possible. So in the large enterprise we are running, which is got about 2,000 devices or about over 1,500 devices and maybe a little less than 2,000 devices, they are essentially running it with about 12 or 14, 16 cores. And they are running it, it's a modern i7 or one of the high-end i7 processors, and with about 32 gigs of RAM. It's not a very expensive server or anything. It's not like you got to spend $10,000 on that server or anything like that. And they have, I believe, a 1 terabyte SSD, of which after having run for about 5 or 6 months now, they have about 60 gigs of storage space. So this is continuous data collection across those number of devices over the last 6 months is taken up about 60 gig.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, it's a big saving, isn't it?
Yeah, and also we see this is just the start. We know how to save both disk space and some of the memory and the CPU even more, and we'll talk about that in a second.
So, because you can't have within the open source, you can't have distributed scaled out pollers. Is that right?
Correct. So good question again. Thanks for pointing that out. In the open source, so the poller in the open source is also a distributed poller whereby you can run multiple workers, but all the workers have to run on the same device. They cannot run on multiple servers. So you can get multiple remote workers, meaning running on multiple different servers in the enterprise version, not in the open source.
Okay, cool. And then with the enterprise, can you have, I would say, like remote pollers? So you've got pollers close to the target.
No, we don't have that ability yet. So today, for example, the person who's running it for those 2,000, that enterprise is basically spread all over the world. Pretty much, I believe, on all the 7 continents, if I'm not mistaken. And they are running all their poller from North America, I think.
Okay, cool.
And one of the other things, there are many things that we are doing. For example, in the upcoming release, one of the other things you can do is you can say, I have this namespace, which probably is on a low bandwidth link to say some part of the world, which is not as heavy on bandwidth. And you can say that particular namespace, I want you to poll at a slightly different interval than say this other namespace, which is in North America. So we allow you to be able to poll different namespaces without having to, today you cannot do that actually in the open source. In the enterprise, you can. Or even within the enterprise, you can say, my backbone is a set of devices where I want you to be able to poll those devices at a far lower frequency than the ones in the fabric itself. And again, you don't have to spin out multiple pollers or anything like that. You can do it all from a single inventory. That's something that's possible in the open source.
Yeah, because I know within the open source, there's a lot of options for tuning.
Yeah. There's even more
the polling.
Yeah.
Is there more tuning? There's more nerd knobs for the tuning in the enterprise, or?
It's not nerd knobs. So one of the things I try and avoid is giving nerd knobs. So two things I try. First thing, I try and make the defaults good enough so that most people don't have to touch any of the knobs. The second thing is that because I work on the premise that if you turn on SuzieQ, you should not harm the network in any way. You should be able to not gather data maybe potentially, but don't lock out users. Don't, because they typed in the wrong credentials, don't bring down the devices. So with that perspective in mind, none of the knobs that we are adding in the enterprise even are nerd knobs. They are all knobs that are coming in because users have very specific use cases. As an example, I have a poller for a particular geographic center that has got a, not center, location, that has a far lower bandwidth. So I don't want you to pull the data as often. But I don't want you to now say, therefore, for just that one namespace, I want you to turn everybody else also to be polling at a lower frequency. So they are not nerd knobs. They are all precise. So for example, another example, this particular one may go into open source as well, is the fact that if you ever use wireless controllers, the network administrators for the wireless are different from the network administrators sometimes for the wired side. And if that is the case, you don't get privileged access to some of the devices. And so you need to be able to turn off and say like, oh, if you're accessing a wireless controller, don't assume privileged access, just run with the commands you can. So don't attempt to privilege it. Don't attempt to do privilege escalation. If you run Ansible, for example, it's the equivalent of become sudo or not.
Yeah. Okay. Well, excuse my terminology with nerd. I wasn't saying nerd knobs in a bad way. It's a good way to be able to customize things, right? So
yes.
It's all good.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. So that is about the poller. Thanks for those questions. We also come with an enterprise GUI, which looks completely different. We allow you to draw topologies. We allow you to run asserts, workflows, all kinds of things from run complex queries, all of them from the GUI. And the GUI, enterprise GUI, looks completely different. It's built from ground up. It looks nothing like the open source. So some screens may look a little similar because there's only so many ways to slice a pie. But in general, it looks completely different. It's far more powerful. It's far easier to use, and it's far more feature rich. And of course, it's way faster than the open source.
It looks great. So is this not? So it's not based on the? Is it Streamlit?
No, it's not based on Streamlit at all. This is a completely native GUI app, React Java web-based app.
It looks nice. It looks nice.
And for example, when we do topologies, we can do topology based on LLDP, which is the cabling. We can do topology based on a protocol like BGP. We can do topology based on a VRF. That's something that's been added. It may come out in this release or in the next release, the VRF part of it. Or you can do it on other things. Within BGP, you can say, I want you to be able to show me the topology of a particular AFI-SAFI. Or if you're running IBGP, I want you to be able to show me the topology of the IBGP by specifying the ASN. So you can look at the network in very many different perspectives inside. Another example, and this you particularly will like, Rick, because you've asked for it, is we support a config viewer and a diff. So you can compare the configuration against other peers. So for example, if you have done network automation and you want to see that there are as few differences between two leaves, you can easily check that. Or for the same device, you can check how the configuration has changed over time. So this is another thing that we support in the enterprise.
Oh, nice. So is that coming over to the open source or?
Not this, obviously not the GUI part is not coming over to the open source. And the enterprise, the other part from a CLI perspective, it's in the to-do list. At some point, will get implemented, I believe, because like I said, I don't want to stop, or I'm not de-emphasizing the open source at all. It'll continue to get features, but obviously the enterprise will get them first and will be there much sooner than the open source. And some features you'll never get in the open source because, for example, the config view diff via the GUI is not something that we plan to add to the open source. At least I think from an open source perspective, the GUI is kind of frozen to a large extent, except for bug fixes, security, etc.
Yeah, that's quite a killer feature, isn't it? To be able to kind of then do a diff between two different times.
Yeah.
It's nice.
And so with that said, we can go back from the enterprise GUI. The next thing, I don't have a slide back. The next thing is the enterprise grade analyzer. So even the analyzer is completely different. So there is a reduction in memory usage for data gathered. So if you look at the data gathered in a real life data center for over a month, and you look at saying, hey, I want to do a route show view equals all. The amount of RAM taken when you do a route show view equals all has gone from 25 gig of RAM usage to 600 meg. So 25 gig is what is used in the open source, 600 meg is what is used in the enterprise. That's a dramatic reduction in the amount of RAM that we use. And this is coming out in the release that's going out this week. And if you look at the time taken to run the same command and the output, if you look at it, it's gone from 140 seconds to 3 seconds.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. So the analyzer being
the CLI, the GUI, whatever is the one, the backend engine that is doing all the analysis.
Yeah, that's quite a big drop, isn't it?
Route show view equals all, or you say route summarize, all of those things. That's what I call the analyzer, the engine that does all the analysis.
Cool. So basically everything is going to be snappier. So
yes, and I'll show that to you in a second if you want through a demo as well.
Yeah, no, that's cool.
And we can, if this switches, can you see the screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you just do a simple one, right? Let's just start with a very simple one. If I do endpoint show, okay, let's do it with the open source first. So here is an example. In enterprise, in the open source, you basically say, so if you notice here, I just want to make sure that we are talking the same thing. So I'm going to the same demo config, and I'm basically saying endpoint show, I want to locate where this endpoint has been across time. And this is a very short time window. And I say view equals all. The basic time it's taken is 1.134. So you can see it here. If I type this again, you can see the pause before the reply comes back. Now let's do the same thing over here in the enterprise version. So you use a different keyword. We change the name network to endpoint because that's what it's really used for. We say endpoint show address equals the same thing, and you will see, and namespace equals nxos find view equals all, and bam. See how much snappier it is. And this is a very small data set. Makes sense? And you see it's the same 11. And again, we are looking at play demo CFG ML, which is exactly the same as it was. The directory we are in is different. This is the enterprise version, as you can see at the top, and this is the open source version. And that's why I have to go back. This demo CFG is from the enterprise versions. That configuration file is sitting there. That's all. Make sense?
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good.
And furthermore, this is the thing that I just told you about, if you look at being moved, it's moved from 1.13 to 0.12, and this is like a 10x reduction in query speed. And the query speeds are actually the algorithm that we use for endpoint location is completely different because in the enterprise, people want to be able to run certain workflows where they want to locate not one endpoint, 10,000 endpoints at the same time. And I'll show you, we have a complex way to specify it. You're wondering like, hey, Dinesh, how do I type in 10,000 MAC addresses or IP addresses on this line? You don't do it this way. We compute it in a different way, and we create a complex query pipeline. So you're not really typing in anything. So all of that is possible. We can gather the endpoint location for over 10,000 endpoints in under 10 seconds. Can't do that in the open source. So the enterprise grade poller is the enterprise grade analyzer is completely different from the open source again, even though it's the same commands or roughly the same commands that you type every single time. The next thing we have is what I call sophisticated queries. And so when I mentioned the fact that you can run through a lot of endpoints, 10,000 endpoints, and you don't have to type those endpoints, or you don't even have to put them in a file and then point to the file. We'll do all of that stuff without you having to do it. So basically, we have a query engine, and this query engine allows you to be able to look at data across tables. And you can compose these queries both via the GUI and using just simple YAML files. So no coding involved. And the other aspect of the query engine is you can look across data sources. So you can look at data from the route table, from the BGP table, from the interface table, mix them up in a particular interesting way, and then be able to look at the data. Or as I mentioned at the start of the talk, you can take the data from SuzieQ, take the data from Cisco ICE database or some other third-party database, merge the two together, and look at information in a completely different way than you otherwise can.
So I suppose you've got it there. I was just thinking about the output from that. So the output is that you can obviously see it by the GUI.
Yes, you can see it via the GUI. You can see the output via the GUI. You can even type it via the CLI. I'll show you how to do that in the CLI too. You can do all of these things via both the CLI, the GUI, and the REST API. None of those things change. It's just how you compose them and what is capable of the feature, but the outputs are all the same. Today, you can get the output and you can then save it to a markdown file. The one benefit you have is we have increased usability, so you can specify the output file directly in the command itself. So for example, over here, when I type this command, you can say out file. Oh, sorry, this is the open source. I can say endpoint show, and I can say out file, specify the file I want to write it to, and I can specify the format. And I'll just write it to the file with that format. So I can say out file equals temp endpoint.csv, format equals CSV, and I can say that there is a separator. Format equals CSV. No, I gotta go back here and probably put this in quotes. And you can have that written out now, and the output has gone to the CSV file. And you can come out and say less temp endpoint.csv, and there is your CSV file.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's quite a cool feature, isn't it?
Yeah, and there are, again, the basic idea in the enterprise is to lower the friction as much as possible, so that the whole point of SuzieQ for me when I started it was, I don't want to build a tool that requires network operators to learn new skills any more than they need to. So be able to point, if you've got netbox, we'll take the netbox as input and directly get it to run across. If you give me, what is the word for it? Ansible, I'll take the Ansible inventory and run it across. So you don't have to do anything more sophisticated than necessary. You learn very few skills. So even from as you put out the nerd knob, you need to know a few things to avoid maybe tripping over some things like the TACAC server, because we run really fast. SuzieQ is really fast. What people have said is not only the storage, but also how fast it runs. In comparison to some of the competitors, we run really fast and we are very light. And so the one danger we have is we can overrun the TACAC server. So you will need to turn on the nerd knob to throttle how many commands or how many logins we attempt within a particular duration to avoid overrunning the TACAC server or any other authentication server you might have. And SuzieQ only requires read-only access, just to be clear. But the important point coming back to this query engine is this becomes now the model by which we will generate more additional reports, more sophisticated reports, build dashboards and alerts. This becomes a single way in which you do a lot of different things. And what are some example queries? You can construct queries that say, show me all VLANs which don't have any MAC address. So a company that, an enterprise that wants to run through a network refresh wants to figure out how to be able to do this because they want to turn off and deactivate VLANs that are not being used, but VLANs go everywhere and they have no way of knowing how to answer this question in a simple way. With SuzieQ, it's trivial. And someone else said, I want to see all the server-facing ports with multiple MAC addresses behind them. Why is this interesting? Well, if you're in an industrial warehouse, there are people who have gone and attached layer 2 switches to just extend the number of ports, unmanaged switches, unauthorized switches without being told. And the way you track them is you look at server-facing ports with multiple MAC addresses behind them and you say, oh, those are the ones that I need to catch. That's not okay. And you can do all of that with simple queries, which is not possible, for example, in the open source. Another one, all of these, by the way, are queries that people are using today with the enterprise. Or show me all the unused ports in the last quarter, meaning ports that have not been used in the last quarter. Why? As part of a network refresh, people are trying to figure out, do I need to buy the same number of Catalyst 9800 switches as the Catalyst 3850 switches? Because how many unused ports do I have? So for you to figure out the logic to do all of that, you don't have to worry about all of that. You just use SuzieQ to answer all those questions.
That's really cool because it kind of complements the whole the big picture with SuzieQ, right? Being the fact that it's all about observability. You're getting all of this information back, and it kind of gets to the point where you've got all the information. It's how to make that information and kind of get the actions out of it, and to be able to ask the right questions. And this is where this comes in. So. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's really cool. I've already got starting to think of a few questions.
Yeah, please go ahead, ask me as many as you want. And this is the picture of the graphical construction of the query. You can graphically pull and connect and type in information and graphically construct the query. And in the this you can do already in the release that exists. In the upcoming release, when I say upcoming, I mean the one that's going to go out the end of this week, is going to be one that will allow you to also edit queries that you have already created graphically.
That's really cool. And so did you mention that you can pull in from other data sources?
Yes.
As well.
Just to be very clear, that's not maybe that people are using it in production today.
So the limitation, I suppose, to frame my question, is to bring in another data source. Does it have to be in a certain format? Can you bring in it via a REST API, or does it have to be like a CSV?
Whatever is the format that they provide. This will be specific. This will be something that will have to be a little more custom, right? Because the way the data is stored, the sense of the data, all of that, certain fields. For example, I have seen the same Cisco ICE database being populated with completely different fields in two completely different enterprises. So the fields, what they mean, etc., are specific to each enterprise. So we will have to work a little bit to pull that information out. But yeah, in general, we will pull it out in the format that it provides. Then, that's not we don't normalize it, but it's stored as is.
Yeah, that's a killer feature, because I was thinking whether you could, so the use case I was thinking in mind was to pull data in from, like, say, the NIST database.
Yeah.
Around all the different vulnerabilities, which is going to basically be like, we got these different CVEs for these different versions. And then obviously you're getting the actual NOS versions running.
Yeah.
Marry them up.
Exactly.
Then you can start saying what is a CVS of higher than 8 or whatever it could be.
Yeah.
The world's on fire.
Yeah.
Do what you need to. So.
And not only that, here is the other aspect you can do. Suppose, for example, and people are doing this again. This is pretty much everything I'm telling you, people are doing in the enterprise today. So it is not a theoretical use case, because honestly, some of these use cases, I wouldn't even know to dream them up. It's only when people deploy it and I hear about it that I go, oh. So one of the other things people are doing is, hey, you know what? Our Cisco ICE policy changes over time. We just pull it into SuzieQ. every time we change it. And now we have a history of how our policy has changed over time. So you don't even have to worry about. So SuzieQ becomes a repository of networks changing over time. If you are a network operator and you've got data sitting in a CSV file, in a hopefully decent format, then you can pull that into SuzieQ and then add that to. So for example, let's just take a simple example. I've seen network operators have in a CSV file subnets associated with VLANs. Or they have got locations of certain devices in a spreadsheet. You can pull that, import it into SuzieQ, and then construct a query that says, take the device output, take the output from the CSV file, that I have, the Excel spreadsheet that I have, marry the two and tell me for every device, what's its location. Bam, done.
So the interesting thing is, I don't know if you just touched upon it a minute ago, is around the kind of the time-based analysis. So you kind of marrying up all this information,
yeah,
getting it into this new. It's probably another bad term I was going to use is blob, which is probably a bad term. After this, Dennis, you're going to be going, what are these terms you're saying, Rick? You're killing me. Right, but once you've got this kind of this aggregated amount, like this data, do you write it to the database to be able to then put a timestamp against it to then say, because that's
timestamp it, but we don't save it in the Parquet format yet, because the way I look at it, and people are going to probably kill me for this bad analogy, but think of it in the form of a relationship. When you get into a relationship, you start by going on a date. So think of like, I'm pulling this data from this file. I don't know if I really want to do anything more with it. I don't want to convert it into a format and store it and save it and have it there, be there forever. I want to probably throw it away. I don't know what I'll do with it. So you're still experimenting, you're playing, so you can have a date kind of thing, which is the format stays as it is. Or you can say, like, I start there, but I continue to see an evolution. I keep adding more stuff because I see the evolution of the location has changed. So I go update my Excel spreadsheet and I want it re-imported into SuzieQ. Or you say, like, you know what, this is now actually a first-class citizen inside SuzieQ. I want to be able to ingest all this data and save it in SuzieQ's native format, whatever that be, so that I'll be able to get all the performance enhancements, everything. Because in the format of where it is either, the original native format, or it is saved, whether over time or as a single snapshot, that stays untouched in the user format the way it was given. We don't attempt to modify that input in any format. But we could potentially start to say, we are going to normalize it and store it inside the Parquet if your organization, for example, supports a particular format that is now normalized across various different pieces. For example, you could be normalizing certain things across info blocks, across your ICE, across your something else, flow database maybe, merge them all together in a more normalized fashion so that you can see everything cleanly inside SuzieQ. So, one might say MAC address with capital MAC. Someone else might say MAC adder. Someone else might say MAC address as one word. You want to normalize all of that stuff and save it as one, we can do all of that. But that's again an evolution. We support the evolution of data into SuzieQ as the user sees fit and grows with it.
So it's like the opposite way round to the kind of movement around source of truth, right?
Yes.
Because there's an aggregation of kind of having a single source of truth. Yes. From multiple sources, and then you kind of aggregate it into one and you kind of read from that. But what you're doing here is it's actually like from the other side, it's from the actual what you're pulling from the network and the actual what's actually deployed. You're aggregating that as well. So
yeah, because the basic idea for me is the ability to tell users, if you're doing something already one way, I don't want you to reinvent and relearn everything all over again. So say with counters, I'm storing everything in Prometheus right now. You're telling me that if I have to do counters with SuzieQ, I have to start migrating everything into SuzieQ. Now you just split them, and that's just a cognitive dissonance, a decision point, a fork in the road that they have to deal with. Instead, just say like, no, leave it in Prometheus. We'll suck it out of Prometheus. Don't worry. As and when you need it, we'll suck it out of Prometheus.
Cool. Oh, that's great.
So, and then of course, like I said, you can run queries and then you get the output in the same formats. And you see this little thing at the bottom, you can use that again in the GUI to automatically download it into CSV, Markdown, a bunch of the JSON, all of those formats. So you can run the queries from within. So that sophisticated queries is one. The integration with third-party data that we've taken a lot of time already talking about. Like I said, we can get the information out. The other way people are looking at it is to look at Cisco's or any vendor's end-of-life list and to be merging it with SuzieQ's data to be able to get the output of what is really involved. And the same thing, network operators often store useful information in Excel spreadsheets. We can pull it out of there and be integrating it with SuzieQ's data. So everything is like annotated, rich, and be able to look at data in a meaningful way within SuzieQ without having to require you to change everything to store everything as SuzieQ. So the next thing that we've added is network validation. And the basic idea there was that people, if DevOps means something, it certainly means coding. And as anybody who's done any bit of coding knows, coding is fine, maintaining it is hard, writing code is fine, maintaining it is hard, and writing tests to validate is even harder. And with networks, it gets really hard. And what I've noticed is that many people are given either a very high level view of the world, like, be happily married. Okay, that depends very much on what you want out of marriage and individual personalities and a million things, versus let's share the workload, or you do laundry one week, I do the laundry the other week. It's a little more precise. What I find is being able to be a little more specific but be declarative with respect to network validation is a useful thing. So the validation model in SuzieQ is assert based. So you make assertions, where assertion is basically a declaration of what you expect of the network. The asserts are declarative, they are reusable, and they are hierarchical. And what I mean by all of that, I will talk about in a second. So what's the difference in terms of validation between the open source and enterprise? Anybody who's used the open source version knows that we have a few predefined checks like BGP assert, OSPF assert, interface assert. Those asserts are fixed. They are not customizable, and only a few tables can be checked. In the enterprise edition, we can do all kinds of asserts. There's a library of asserts. It allows for easy customization and a no-code approach. So basically, you're writing YAML code. In a future release, we will also add the ability to do other things graphically. And you can assert pretty much every single table. And the assertions can be based on the sophisticated queries that we just talked about. So you can construct a very sophisticated query, then assert on that output. So you can do really complex things. And of course, the assertions have GUI support. So why do people need customizable or extensible asserts? Because networks are different in subtle but important ways. So for example, you can't in the open source validate that the VLANs that are valid for your network are the ones that are actually instantiated. You can't provide it a list and say, here is what I want you to validate is instantiated across my network. You can't validate that a VLAN is on a specific host. So you can't say that a particular host, a particular MAC address needs to belong to a particular VLAN. Or you can't validate that a VLAN or an SVI, in this particular case, I say VLAN, but it's really an SVI, belongs to a specific subnet. All these are specific validations that every user asks for or needs to do as part of their network, but they can't do that today. So essentially, like I said, we have got a assert library kind of thing. So you can write your own asserts. We can come up with a bunch of them and we can provide it to you. And as this shows you, this is a simple example of an assert that tells you that all you're doing is verifying that your loopback IP interfaces have an IP address and that the loopbacks are not duplicate. So you simply assert that the loopback IP address is unique and that it is not empty. That's all you say. You don't worry about how we figure out what are the different loopback interfaces. You don't worry about how do I figure out whether it is unique or not. We take care of that. We do this repeatedly for multiple things across various different things. So for example, if you're trying to match MTUs, you have a simple way to say, just match MTU. Just validate that the MTUs across the interface is consistent. You don't have to worry about figuring out, oh, wait, I want Ethernet 2/1 on the switch, which means I think the peer is that. And so get the MTU from that peer and then do it. We just take care of everything. You simply say, I want to assert that the MTU is consistent. Same thing, I want to assert that the port mode is consistent. You don't need to say anything more than that assertion. That's why I call it declarative. You basically just assert what you want and you don't worry about how to do something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So with the asserts, you can put in there, is that regex, like globbing?
Yes, you can put in regexes as filters. You can say I want to assert, because some people have, for example, in case of, what's the word for it? EVPN networks, if you're using MLAG, or you're trying to have a single VTEP across two dual attached server endpoints, you may have another loopback interface over which the IP address is actually not unique. So you want to specify which loopback it is. So that's an example where you might specify that.
Oh, that's cool.
But yeah, you don't have to do loopbacks. I mean, regular expressions, you can use regular expressions where you need to act as filters, or you can just specify them without regex. There are various ways you can do all of these things. The important part are the asserts, where you simply assert what you want.
Can you assert? So you spoke about the custom queries before. Can you kind of merge a whole, or would you even need to do it?
Yeah, you can. So let's take the previous example. Let's say that I want to assert, and you can do this many ways, but let's just, for the sake of this discussion, say that you want to assert that a particular VLAN has no MAC addresses in it, because you have decided, hey, you know what? I want to deactivate this VLAN and I want to validate that this VLAN is not in my network. So imagine, like, for example, you are a campus and you've got 300 VLANs running everywhere, and you've decided you want to deactivate 100 of them. So you're starting with, say, 500, VLAN number 500. You've decided you want to deactivate the one place where it was. You've removed it because it was in the wrong value. So now you've decided 500 is getting deactivated. You want to validate that VLAN 500 is not anywhere in your network. You can simply write a query that checks for VLAN 500, the list of VLANs that don't have a MAC address, then assert that 500 is in that list, and you're done. Cool. You can, of course, do the assertion much more simply by simply saying MAC address, VLAN 500, the result is empty. You can always do that in a very trivial fashion, but I was saying that you could do it in more complex fashions too, using the query as you were suggesting. Does that answer the question you were asking, Rick? Did I understand you correctly?
Yeah. So, but you can basically, you can use the assert against the data that you've done off the custom queries, right? Query. So that's
exactly.
Yeah. Then can you then trigger the asserts from the API?
Yes, all of this is triggerable via the API. Everything I talk about, nothing. I am showing it to you as a GUI, but everything is available via the CLI and the API. Everything.
The CLI?
Yes, and the CLI. Yes.
Right. So that's the thing, because that's the thing that a lot of people have said to me. They said, "Whoa, now I've got all this data.
Yeah.
I've got all these questions. How, I need to kind of create all these questions for it. So now you can give your network operations teams all the various asserts. Oh, that's really nice.
Yeah. So to give you a quick example or a quick demo, so if you go into the SuzieQ Enterprise again version, you can say assert run. The name is if loopback checks, the one that I was showing you there. The namespace is NXOS find, and it just says pass, if you notice there. And you see how quickly it comes back, but it says pass. But you can also say detail equals true, and you get the output of what I've actually looked at. So it's available via the CLI, it's available via the GUI, it's available via the API. Everything I tell you is available via the REST API, the GUI, and the CLI. Sometimes it's a little trickier to do that via the GUI maybe, or sometimes it's a little trickier to do it via the CLI because the GUI is kind of intuitive. So for example, if you run an assert, the output tells you right at the top, a very clean way of saying, like, did everything pass or did everything fail? So you're not scrolling through outputs to figure out what went wrong. So then we also have this thing called report generation, whereby, like I said, you can take the output from various tables, everything, and then generate a set of queries and have the output generated as CSV, JSON, or Markdown. We are looking to add even more in terms of like a PDF output where you could potentially lay out the pages, etc., etc. And the last thing that I had was the fact that we support additional devices and services. So a lot of people have started deploying us in the campus. So we have got support for wireless controllers, like I said, that's coming up right now. We support STP, spanning tree protocol is supported. We support DHCP, and we are adding support for HSRP, VRRP. That's not in the release that's coming out now, but will be in the next one. And we are adding even more so everything associated with wireless controllers, what SSIDs do I have, what access points do I have, where are those SSIDs and access points, what MAC addresses are associated with the access points and the endpoints. Then show me endpoint. So when you do endpoint tracking, we can now track an endpoint via the support for wireless controllers across wired and wireless devices.
No, that's really cool. With the STP side of things, it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like a whole thing in itself, isn't it? Like STP.
Yeah.
Like, do you support like all the different flavors?
We support PTSD plus. We do support MSTP, but what we don't support right now, and so I don't call it fully supporting MSTP. We'll get the data and we'll display everything. But if you say show me the MSTP or the spanning tree for VLAN 25, we haven't yet pulled down the information of mapping VLAN 25 to a specific spanning tree instance ID and then displaying that.
Does that have any bearing on the way that you do the path calculations?
Yes, it does. So in a pure L2 network now, I can do forwarding. I can look up where every MAC address is and then follow the spanning tree path. Exactly.
So when I asked you to come on and do this, I didn't think that there was going to be fair, as much as this.
Yeah. I mean, so you can see how busy we have been in trying to get all of this done and be able to keep going. So yeah, it's quite a bit of work, but I think again, the architecture and what we have done right up front in terms of some of the design choices are helping us. And we are just getting started. Some of the time savings you saw, we are going to cut that even further by some of the additional choices we are making as we move forward. Because primarily our fundamental goal is to enable people to be able to use the tool independent of the size of your network. You've got 10 switches. It should not be far more complicated for you just to set it up. You don't have to set up a Cassandra database with like 20 other services that are running with 20 other microcontrollers. And then by the time you figure out if something is wrong, it's really complicated. I want to keep things as simple as possible while allowing you to scale at the same time. And, again, back to we are blessed with technologies, ideas, open source, where people are allowing us to be able to build on top of each other. That's another reason I want to continue to support open source. It's a give back. It is not like, hey, you know what? I've taken all the stuff from all the open source people and I'm building fancy stuff and I'm not giving anything back. No, I want to continue to give back to the community. And so that's why open source will remain something that I'll continue to support and work on and build. So, and then we have additional improved usability. So to give you some example of that. So today, for example, if you do, and these are all trivial things, right? So for example, if I say device show and I type namespace, you get completion for the namespace. So I can type Acme and then I can type host name and you get completion for host name. So you get all of these kinds of things happening within the data set, within the CLI in a far more usable way than is possible in the open source. So with that, today we are being used across multiple enterprises in production, from sites ranging from 20 devices to 2,000 devices. That's the largest we have been tested at so far. To be clear, it's not like we can't run for bigger ones. And as we have shown you, we are continuously changing the game by making the whole thing very sleek so that we can run with as small a memory footprint as possible. We'll be able to support also running on servers which aren't potentially as compute intensive. But if your network is large, you have no choice but to be able to run a heavier and beefier server. And also, to be able to, by making some of these enhancements of trying to lower the memory use and to improve the speed, it also means that we can deal with much larger networks quite easily. And we are being used by companies ranging from technology companies to MSPs to financials to industrial warehouses. And we have networks ranging from data centers. That's where I began. But today we are being used in campus and small ISPs and IXPs. So we got the Gartner Cool Vendor Award last year for the work we are doing. That was pretty, I call it an award, but I think they don't call it an award. They call it that you were named a cool vendor. So just to be clear, like you, the nerd now thinking I don't get dinged for calling it an award. It is a Gartner Cool Vendor. We were named a Gartner Cool Vendor for all the things that we are doing. And we talked about the enterprise differentiation. So from a call to action, I recommend people contact us for an enterprise demo or go ahead and try the open source, join the Slack channel. The link is the same place. And with that, we come to the end of it.
That's great, Dinesh. I mean, I would say to folks, definitely the Slack channel is really active, right? Super responsive. And you have your monthly community meetups as well.
Yes.
Which are highly recommended.
I also put the NetEng Labs YouTube video channel where I upload the monthly monthly meetup sessions.
Good stuff. Highly recommend folks to reach out to Dinesh if you've got any questions or you want to learn any more about the enterprise Suzie Q. And yeah, Dinesh, thanks again for your time today. It's been an absolute blast.
Thank you, Rick. You're welcome. Anytime. Have a wonderful evening.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.